Congressman Bera has served in the U.S. House of Representatives since 2013, representing California's 6th District. Representative Bera currently serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on East Asia and Pacific and on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Thanks so much. You've been thinking a lot more about critical minerals. Can you tell me how you've seen critical minerals and minerals diplomacy in particular elevated as a policy issue within House Foreign Affairs Committee over the last year?
Absolutely. In recent months, we've seen, because of the escalating trade rhetoric between the United States and China, some critical choke points. So if we didn't understand the importance of having redundant supply chains, having access to multiple sources, that really exposed it. We can go back to the pandemic, and obviously that also exposed an over-reliance on a single source. So it's been a nonpartisan topic. Democrats and Republicans have been talking about this. It's a topic that comes up in conversation with our allies. Part of the reason why we introduced the Mineral Security Partnership Act is that's a pretty elegant piece of legislation that came out of the Biden administration, but we should be working with our friends and allies to create these redundant supply chains.
And what do better partnerships with our allies look like at a time when minerals are redefining a lot of our relationships?
It means, leveraging, I'm glad we reauthorized the DFC and gave DFC a little bit more flexibility, but it means using those tools with the financing tools that Japan might have, or Korea or others. It means, going into Mongolia with the Koreans and creating new industries and so forth. It means going into Africa with our allies, perhaps working with Australia and others to build these redundant supply chains. So again, we're not just reliant on a single source. In this case, China very strategically over decades has built out their market and capacity in the critical mineral space, their refining capacity, et cetera. And then we also notice some of the market manipulation that makes it very difficult for others to break into these industries to create these mines and so forth. So it's not that the rare earths and these critical minerals are not readily available. It's just very difficult to build this market out because China does have a dominant position.
And global diversification takes a lot of effort. When you think that China actually leveraged its foreign policy to get minerals from around the world for the better part of 30 or 40 years. 2025 was a big year for some minerals legislation. Can you tell us about some of these legislative efforts?
Certainly we're excited about the Mineral Security Partnership, but you also see other pieces of legislation, trying to align trade promotion with, critical minerals. You see, as Chairman Mass has gone through a State Department reauthorization, we've looked at the E-Bureau and what does that look like and how does that also align with our strategic values here. So, as a preview, I think some of this is all going to come together. We're talking across committees of jurisdiction to try to put together a big package that would put us in a much better position.
What does a strengthened mineral security partnership look like?
Strengthening Mineral Security Partnership is aligning various entities. So it's aligning our trade agenda. It's aligning our diplomatic agenda. It's aligning, as I said before, our financing tools. Because again, it may not be that we're doing refining in the United States per se, but it may mean that we build markets in Malaysia or Vietnam or other places that we strategically go into Africa, where you see some of these supplies, working with our partners to build out these mines, because we may not be able to do it by ourselves, but if we work again with, through, our allies and friends, we can hopefully build some redundancy.
Beyond financing, what are the other touch points of what better collaboration look like? Because we sometimes limit it to money, but it's more than that.
Yeah, it's more than money. It is, again, strategically building out refining capacity, strategically looking at what countries we may want to go in and build a closer relationship. But then, even closer to home, in Southern California by the Salton Sea, you have huge lithium deposits. That's a conversation that's come up multiple times, where could you build out in a very environmentally friendly, closed way, take advantage of some of our own critical minerals here.
So when we look ahead to 2026, how do we build on the efforts of 2025 from a legislative perspective?
I think you take various pieces of legislation across different jurisdictions, Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, and can you put those together in a single package? Again, a small preview, I think we're getting pretty close to pulling a bunch of things together into a larger package, working in collaboration with the administration and so forth, because again, we recognize this is an important area. I mean, another interesting area that we've been thinking about, and it came up last week because the cobalt folks were in our office, and they said something really interesting, that 18% of the cobalt that we need is sitting in our desk drawers, right? In our devices that are just sitting there. I'd love to be able to get rid of my old iPads and iPhones and all of that. So recycling is another component of this, and how do we think about that? How do we invest in that so those devices are put to use?
And we're all kind of sitting now with the same objective on the horizon. We want more resilient supply chains that can't be weaponized to ensure that our manufacturing industry stay intact, to make sure that we can protect ourselves. The legislative agrees on that. The executive branch agrees on that. But what does better coordination look like between the legislative and executive branches of government look like on this topic?
I mean, it means we should be talking to one another. And that doesn't always happen in this administration at this moment in time. I think this is an area where you do see strategic alignment, Democrats, Republicans. Chairwoman Kim and I are, either one of us could be sitting here, we'd be saying the same thing. You saw that in the hearing that we had earlier this year as well, that, again, it's a very nonpartisan issue. Industry also aligns with us because they recognize the critical value. And then, if you look at the DoD and the importance of having these supplies, they're critical to our national security.
One of the lines from one of the previous panels was that mining sometimes gets caught up in political football, right? We start, we stop, we prioritize, and we deprioritize. How do we ensure that the solutions that you're developing now have longevity and durability at a time when things do feel like a game of football?
Yeah, I mean, in this particular case, again, I think pre-pandemic, folks got relatively lax in terms of thinking these supplies would be there forever. Obviously, the pandemic disrupted that. We've seen some of the potential coercive nature that supplies could be used against us if there is a conflict with the PRC. So I think there is a real recognition for a national security economic perspective. We are going to have to build redundant supply chains. I mean, there are also conversations about what do stockpiles look like? Do you create those stockpiles? How do you replenish those stockpiles? How do you move things through if there's degradation over time of these critical minerals? So again, those are conversations that are taking place.
One of the things I always think is that the U.S. has and our allies have an advantage when we go to some of the global South countries that you mentioned. We often bring a better way of doing business. How do we ensure that we are not creating a trade-off between speed and doing things right?
Yeah, so if you look at I think President Trump would take it as a compliment that he's been massively disruptive in terms of how we do aid, development, investment. If we look at the African continent, I do think the Trump administration is going to take a much more transactional approach. So, instead of just direct aid and development, they may say, how do we invest here? Okay, we need these critical minerals. DRC, you've got cobalt. We'll come in, we'll invest. What's that return on investment? It's a different way of doing business, but I do think you'll see more of that transactional approach. And again, maybe that will be done in partnership with our allies.
So it sounds like commercial diplomacy has kind of replaced a traditional aid mentality.
I think that's where the Trump administration has gone. Will the pendulum swing back somewhere in the middle? I don't think it'll swing all the way back. And again, just because of Beijing's ability to undercut price, to undercut, make it very difficult for mines to be competitive. I think that is where we have to leverage our financing tools, work together with our allies and others.
So how do we better use the tools in our toolkit? The U.S. government has a lot of tools. You mentioned DFC, we have EXIM, we have U.S. Trade and Development Agency. How do we better, none of these institutions are really designed for minerals at the outset.
No, so again, how do we bring them all together? How do we create, for lack of a better, an individual that's working across the various agencies and across departments looking at this? Again, we recognize this is critical to our national security, critical to our economic security. So instead of it being siloed in one agency or another agency, maybe we do need that, for lack of a better way of describing it, a critical minerals czar that can kind of look across the entire spectrum of the U.S. government.
Should that be a person? Should that be an institution? What does better coordination look like? Because I think you're right. I think here at CSIS we counted, and there are about 15 agencies that are somehow working on minerals right now. I mean,
it's probably that. It probably is an individual that has responsibility with a team of individuals that can look across the U.S. government as a whole. It probably, and then you have someone who can coordinate with Congress as well.
Are there any other legislative mechanisms we can use to advance this agenda?
So I think there is, and what you talked about earlier is we've got to take a long view here, right? Because to build out that redundancy, to build out these mines, we can't stop and start. We've got to invest and take that longer view. So I do think that's where Congress has to be invested. Again, I think we've got all the tools. Can we bring the tools together in a much more coordinated way? And if there are places where, again, I do think we did a smart thing by, in the reauthorization of the DFC, giving it a little bit more flexibility, giving it the ability to work in countries that previously it probably wouldn't have been able to work in. So, again, looking for those areas. But I think that's where, if we do it legislatively, then it's not going to shift from one administration to the next. It'll be a much more long-term investment. What are the key DFC changes that you think would make it better fit for minerals? I mean, giving it flexibility to work in different countries, giving it flexibility to work in slightly wealthier countries than it currently has, giving it additional financing tools and additional resources. I think we also have to be flexible because we may have to work in some countries that aren't necessarily the best actors, but that's where these resources are. So what does that look like? I think we'll also have to, again, China is able to undercut the price point. But if we want to build out, let's say Australia is very interested in building out these industries, it may come at a slight economic upcharge to industry and so forth. But again, if we don't want to be vulnerable to coercion, industry may have to do some of that as well. Do you think it's industry and government that might have to be step in on that? I mean, I think we'll have to do this together. And again, I'll come back to recycling. I think that really is a component here as well. What does that look like, and how do we make that economically viable and build out that industry? So, final question. Looking ahead to 2026, if you had to prioritize two things that whole of government, legislative, executive, could work together most meaningfully to advance our goals of creating more resilient supply chains, what would they be? I mean, I would hope on the congressional side that we look across the various committees of jurisdiction, look at the various pieces of legislation and bring them together in a single package. In addition, as we're looking at the E-Bureau and what tools they need, that's from the foreign affairs side of things. How do we modernize that with the focus here? So that would be one thing that I would do. I would hope we're doing that with the administration, with the Senate. So again, you'll have a piece of legislation that can move fairly quickly. And again, I think that is going to happen. Sounds like it might be imminent. Maybe, could be. That'd be very exciting. I mean, it is really exciting to see minerals not only be bipartisan, but also one of the areas where we're able to mobilize multilateral cooperation. Yeah, I think this is an area where mineral diplomacy could work. It's in our conversation with our friends and allies. everyone recognizes the vulnerability here. Everyone recognizes it's not in anyone's interest to just have a single source supply chain, that we will have to work together to create these markets, to create the competition and create redundant supply chains. So again, for a lot of the advanced nations, I think everyone in a very intentional way is, moving in this direction.
And global South countries realize how important it is as well. I mean, they're very much racing to be part of this discussion.
Absolutely. So I think if we're smart about it, it certainly helps build out industry in the global South. That helps address some needs, and hopefully, we don't just, we do it in a way that's economically beneficial to some of these countries.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm excited to see how these legislative efforts continue to strengthen our mission clarity and execution.
More to come.
Stay tuned, guys. Thank you.